Okay, we move on to our last speaker in this track, Professor Anu Ramaswamy. Sorry to keep you waiting. Professor Ramaswamy is a professor at Princeton University in the departments of India Studies, Civil and Environmental Engineering, and the High Meadows Environmental Institute. She is an interdisciplinary environmental engineer recognized as a pioneer and leader on the topic of sustainable urban infrastructure systems. Her work explores how 7 key sectors that provide water, energy, food, buildings, mobility, connectivity, waste management, and the green public spaces shape human and environmental well-being from local to global scales. Professor Ramaswamy's work integrates environmental science and engineering, industrial ecology, public health, and public affairs with a human-centered and systems focus. She is the inaugural director of the Chadha Center for Global India at Princeton University and the lead principal investigator and director of the National Science Foundation-supported Sustainable Healthy Cities Network. And she serves on the United Nations Environment's International Resource Panel and the United States NSF Advisory Committee for Environmental Research and Education. Please welcome Professor Anu Ramaswamy. Professor Ramaswamy, you are...
Thank you so much for having me here.
Yes, the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you for the very warm introductions. And I really enjoyed looking at the previous presentation, and I hope that I can offer value with my talk here today. And I wish I could be there in person for this really important conference. And I wanted to just say that my focus area, as you'll see, is on sustainable, healthy, and equitable cities. And I've been asked to talk specifically about social sustainability, justice, equity, and inclusion. And as I was introduced, I am the lead PI and director of NSF Sustainable Healthy Cities Network. I also direct the Chadha Center for Global India at Princeton University, and I cross multiple disciplines. So for today, I thought, it's a broad interdisciplinary audience. I'll talk a little bit about just how we think about sustainability, inclusion, inequality, equity, and justice, and why infrastructure and food systems are so central to advance equity as well as resource sustainability. So that'll be the first part of my talk. I'll then talk about the role of data, of science, and scientists. What role can we play? And then I'll give you some examples of projects that I've done looking at infrastructure inequality in India, energy inequality in the US, inequality in exposure to extreme heat, actually in India, and then some concluding thoughts. And it's a high-level talk. We won't have time to get into the data science aspects, but I think the idea here is how does data inform social sustainability? So I'll begin with the framing. And in my group, we define sustainable development based on a wonderful paper by O'Neill et al. As a good life for all within planetary boundaries. And I think it's a really simple definition. We've all used the earlier definition from, the Nordstrom definition of sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. First of all, it's very long. It also doesn't really tell you how to measure progress towards sustainability. And I think with the emerging advances in the sustainability system science literature, this particular definition, I think, offers a lot. So the first thing is it talks about a good life. And so we have to think, well, what is a good life? And then it talks about all. And that all could be current and future generations. It could be inequality between developed and developing nations. It could be inequality within nations. Very often we see rural-urban differences. It could be inequality within urban areas or within rural areas. And often that brings up issues of income, caste, segregation within cities, gender-based inequalities. And, if you want to go further, we can even talk about interspecies. Why are we only talking about humans? What about all the other species? And what are we thinking? Biodiversity is not just in the service of people. Every species could have a right to live and flourish. But we want to agree that in our framing right now, this is a very human-centered view. But I love this definition because it opens up a whole systematic way of thinking about both planetary boundaries, resources, as well as a good life, and whatever our conception is. What does all mean? Who is included? Who is excluded? And of course, urban areas are a key driver for both sustainable and equitable transitions because they present numerous opportunities, but they also present numerous challenges. So, for example, I work a lot in Asia, and in many parts of the world, this is not a surprise 30 to 40% of the urban population is living in slums or informal settlements that have very little of the basic infrastructure that makes for a good life. There's also rapid urbanization, and the pace of urbanization is causing a lot of rural urban migration, a lot of inequalities along the lines of rural and urban inequality. At the same time, two-thirds of future infrastructure by 2050 to support urbanization hasn't yet been built. And that's because most future urbanization is going to happen in India, Southeast Asia, and the African continents, part of the Middle East. And so we're looking, at this whole development of new infrastructure, which I think you all are very well aware of in your region. And so how do we do that? And can we do that in ways that are different from how they were before? So it is an opportunity, but it's not an easy opportunity. It takes a lot of science, data science, and engagement. It also is important, and so that's what I'm showing here, that people are the center, and these are our 7 key provisioning systems: buildings, energy supply, transportation, water supply, food supply, waste and sanitation, and green and public spaces. And we all know that most cities can't produce everything they need to provide these services within their boundary. And that's why cities are engaged with teleconnections with the hinterland. And so, if you do well designed urban provisioning systems, you could stimulate both rural and urban areas to be thriving with prosperity. And that's what happened in the US when cities like Chicago grew. The Midwest grew too, because the Midwest was providing food. And so you had cities, towns flourishing as the big cities flourished. But this has changed in dynamics as we look at developing countries' urbanization. And so, really thinking through where are we getting stuff from? What happens when we're trading in very critical infrastructure materials? It really affects how well we can develop our cities. We also focus on these 7 key provisioning systems because they simultaneously address multiple aspects of the environment. So you can see the same provisioning systems are now colored in red. This is energy supply. Blue is municipal water supply and sanitation. This pink color is transportation, focused on vehicle operations. The green is food supply. The gray is building and shelter materials and public spaces. And these 7 provisioning systems globally shape a vast majority of greenhouse gas emissions and water withdrawals. And so this is really significant because not only are we exceeding our carbon in the atmosphere, we're also very seriously running out of water in many parts of the world. So that's what you see on this side. And what you see on the right side of your screen is that the same provisioning systems are also shaping mortality at immense scales. And so the World Health Organization estimates 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 premature deaths worldwide is due to inadequate or polluting infrastructure and food provisioning systems. And that by itself is astounding. If I told you 1 in 5 premature deaths is because of our 3 basic provisioning systems, we should really be running to fix them. And that's what this transition is about. Can we focus on these 7 provisioning systems? Because we think if we do it right, we can reshape not only our environmental impact, but also our health impact, which is now contributing to about 20 million premature deaths globally because of these same sectors: air pollution from energy, municipal water and sanitation, accidents, and low sedentary lifestyles with low physical activities, childhood undernutrition, as well as adult poor nutrition without fresh fruits and vegetables, and disasters and extreme events. So I show all this to say that this is the scope of my lab. It's a large scope. We look at how these 7 sectors influence health, well-being, sustainability, and equity. But today I'm just going to focus on the equity piece of it. And so the idea here is that sustainable development is not only about one outcome. It's not just about carbon emissions or water security or health or well-being or energy security, and it's also about equity. And so, how do we put all this together? So, we have a framework that says here are our physical provisioning systems, which you can see here. I hope you can see my cursor moving. But those physical provisioning systems are essential for our social provisioning systems to work. We could not have education, healthcare, emergency services, anything functioning without having good energy supply, mobility networks, food systems, and so forth. And that these two interconnected physical and social provisioning systems together shape environmental sustainability. All of the environment is shaped by the physical flows because that's what is driving the flow of energy, materials, water. They shape human health and well being. And in our group, we look at both the objective measures of health as well as subjective measures of well being. It shapes economy and security, including household security, security from natural hazards, as well as access to livelihoods. And that there are vast differences in different populations being able to achieve these outcomes. And so we look at distributional equity, which is inequality and fairness in the distribution of both determinants, these determinants, the infrastructure systems and the outcomes across scales, but with the goal of reducing disparities for the most vulnerable. So that's a very important definition we've drawn from public health, that we're looking to reduce disparities for the most vulnerable groups with a focus on all these provisioning systems. And so this is a recent paper in the Journal of Industrial Ecology, which digs deeper into it, talks about the social, ecological, infrastructural, urban form features that all shape these outcomes: environment, health, well-being, and equity. And we describe equity, as I mentioned, as fairness in the distribution of burdens and benefits across determinants and outcomes, with the goal of reducing disparity. So it's really important, I think, to have this outcome and definition in mind, because very often we get caught up in trying to look only at the determinants or only at outcomes. We don't focus on who is the most disadvantaged, because everybody can say it's not fair, right? We hear this from everyone. We might hear the wealthiest people or the most advantaged people saying, oh, this is not fair. And so it's really important in the definitions to talk about which disparities are important, which disparities we're focusing on, and why. And this draws from Rawlsian theories of social justice and theories of equity from public health. And so a lot of this is summarized in a paper, if anyone's interested, that looks at this nexus, that we're not interested in only one outcome. So how can we look at the nexus between zero carbon goals, health, climate resilience, and equity? And what are those linkages? Where can we have trade-offs? Where will there be co-benefits? And so I can't delve into the entire science. It's a whole other lecture by itself, but I just wanted to highlight that we are not solving for one outcome. We're solving for multiple outcomes together, which makes it very challenging. And so I just wanted to end by saying the first part of my talk by saying that what then is, we talked about equity, but the way I talked about equity was distributional equity, right? We talked about the distribution of burdens and benefits across determinants and outcomes, but that's not the only aspect of equity that is important. And so this is a very nice framework from Joe Bozeman, my colleague at Georgia Tech, and he has framed this as systemic equity, that not only do you discuss distributional effects, we want procedural equity. And by procedural equity, we mean that the people who are impacted by the engineering transitions or whatever we're proposing are actually engaged in discussions, policy discussions, technology discussion, design discussions on the kinds of changes we want to see in our systems. So that's procedural. Are they engaged meaningfully, not just as a checkbox, but meaningfully engaged, where they can say, no, we don't like this, we want to do something else. And then there's also recognition equity. Do we recognize what are the historical and contextual factors that are the cause of these inequalities? There are systemic causes, and can we recognize those? And some people also include reparations. How do we do reparations? And that all these three dimensions of equity are often referred to as justice. So again, this is the framing we use. There may be different definitions, but I just wanted to be clear that this is where we're going, that we are thinking about justice as having at least these three elements: distributive, procedural, and recognition. And so with that, I'm going to move to the next part of my talk today, which is really to ask ourselves. We all are scientists, engineers, data scientists. What is our role? What is our role in advancing inequality or in advancing equity, justice, and inclusion? And how do we do it? And so I have lots of thoughts. Maybe we can address this in Q&A, but I wanted to share two things that I've learned. And the first is that it's really important to produce good science, but it's good to co-produce it with the people that you want to use it. And so if we want to have science that's meaningful to people who are engaged in these discussions, we want to co-produce it. And I've had the good fortune through all these papers to have collaborated with cities, beginning with the city of Denver. And many of these, my partners, were co-authors in serious scientific papers that we put out. And these papers actually transformed how cities are accounting for their greenhouse gas emissions. So before this work with the city of Denver, cities were only measuring emissions directly within their boundary. And now with this transboundary framework, we're looking at the whole life cycle so that when we do engineered interventions, we don't just shift emissions to someone else, because that really doesn't work, especially for global greenhouse gases. And so I've been really fortunate that we were engaged with the city of Denver's climate action plan, and the city of Denver was then so happy with what we were doing that they said to other cities and to ICLE, which is a network of cities, that this is a group and the methods coming out of this group should be adopted. And so within 5 years of our scientific papers, some of the methods that we had developed became part of the US protocol for cities to count their greenhouse gas emissions. And so I still consider it, this was back in 2012, I consider this actually the pinnacle of my academic achievement to have impact at scale, beginning with a few cities, to actually impact the way multiple cities across the US are thinking and reporting their greenhouse gas emissions. We then worked with the city of Minneapolis on looking at their food system. You can see this is what engagement looks like. Lots of people listening, asking questions. My field work or my work with cities uses at least a few principles that I wanted to share for effective co-production. And one of those is that it has to be situated in a context, that if it's all theoretical with no context, it doesn't work. It's good to have goal orientation, which is shown on number 3. And so in all of my work, I worked with cities that had a plan. They wanted to develop a climate action plan or a heat action plan, often within 1 or 2 years. So it accelerates research, but it also puts it out there in a way that's institutionalized. We want to explicitly recognize different ways of doing things, practitioners, teachers, government officials, citizens, youth, they don't see things the way scientists see it. And so if you're not willing to be challenged and change how you think and the questions you prioritize, I don't think that science is going to be as impactful or meaningful. So I think part of our responsibility is not to come here with blinders or blind spots and think we know the answer, because very often we come up with a framing where we already know the answer to everything. And then that really doesn't work unless we're actually willing to be there and be challenged. And so that happens if you give enough time for learning to happen. We can learn from communities, and this two-way learning takes time and iterations. And so I wanted to just highlight I was part of an advisory committee to the US National Science Foundation. This report is no longer available, but I'm willing to give it to anyone who's interested. But it was an excellent report that really talked about how do you do engaged research to address environmental grand challenges. And so there's a picture of the report, and it drew upon a lot of our experiences, including from Maria Carmen Lemos, who was my co-chair on this report. Okay, so now I'm going to go through a few quick examples, and you should tell me when I have to stop. And I have concluding thoughts. The examples will be really quick so we can have time for discussion. So the first study was the one that actually got a lot of press in India. We developed a differentiated urban metabolism approach to inform equity. And so many of you may be familiar with urban metabolism. We look at the city as an organism, as a cell or any organism, and we look at how much material and energy are used. We have this diagram, inputs of energy, water, materials, outputs of waste, and hopefully value added products as GDP. But we've never had a systematic method to dive down and say, okay, how unequal are these resources? And how unequal is the pollution? And who is generating the pollution and who's exposed to that pollution? And can we address this? So that's what this paper does. It got a good amount of press in India. And what you're seeing, I don't think we need to get into all the details, but we looked at quintiles. That means the bottom 20%, next 20%, all the way up to the top 20%, which you can see on the left. So this is what it is. So the poorest 20% is the dark blue. The next 20% is orange, then gray, then yellow, and the top 20% is in lighter blue. I don't know if you can see all these colors. And we looked at things like car ownership in 3 cities. So who owns cars? No surprise, it's the wealthiest, especially in developing countries. Who owns two-wheelers? It's actually a bit more equal. Who rides taxis? The top 40%. Who travels by bus? The bottom 60%. So you get the chance. Who has diesel generators because the power always goes off? Well, here they are. It's the top 20%. And so on. But who is using biomass resources? It's the bottom 20%. Is predominantly responsible for using of biomass resources because they don't have access or they can't afford fuels. And so when we put all this together, we put this together in the context of emissions. And I'm just showing here pollution emissions, PM 2.5, that are responsible for the health effects that I showed you in that first graph. And I won't go through everything, but you can see all these cars are causing pollution. Biomass is also causing pollution. And when you add it up community-wide, you can see that in these 3 different cities, Delhi, Coimbatore, and Rajkot, in some of these cities, the poorest is only contributing 14%, while the wealthiest are contributing 43%. But in some other cities, which are more rural and developing early in their development urbanization stage, you see that the poorest are also contributing as much as the wealthiest. And our point in all this is that you can't have a broad brush for every city. You actually have to have a mechanism to dig in to these kinds of patterns in different cities. And our data science work is actually now studying all India, we're producing data for 600 districts of India because we're saying each of these cities is actually different. You can't just make sweeping conclusions. And then when we looked at designing for equity, we looked at 12 government policies at the nexus of air pollution and decarbonization. And I won't go through the detail, but you can see most of the policies either only reduce in-boundary pollution by about 2%, which you can see at the bottom here, or they reduce greenhouse gases by 2%. There were only 3 policies that moved you beyond the 2% to actually reduce 6% to 12% of greenhouse gases and even 50% of PM 2.5. And you can see all of them have equity implications. Replacing biomass-based fuels with better fuels, the shifting from private vehicle ownership or to CNG buses. So all of these have implications, phasing out of petrol and diesel vehicles to electric vehicles. So again, should they favor two-wheelers or should we favor cars? And it's very clear, India should favor two-wheelers because most people are driving two-wheelers, only the wealthy are driving cars. And the most interesting thing is that if the wealthiest households did only 10% energy improvement, that's the X. You could get substantial co-benefits on both sides. And so what this kind of analysis is saying, how can you design policies to be more equitable, informed by data? We did a different study in the US where we were very interested in unpacking race and income. And this was published in PNAS with my then postdoc, who's now in China as a faculty member, Kang Tong, and several other colleagues. And one of the things when we were talking about inequality and equity, and we would talk in all these city meetings like you saw, and people would always say, if we said that there was a race effect or a caste effect in India, people would say, but how do you know it's race? It's just income. And I don't mean to say just income. Income is a big thing. But so we wanted to say, can we actually show through data that you can have an impact of race or caste beyond income? And so that's what we did over here. You can see over here, we had 23 census block groups in St. Paul in Minnesota. And you can see the layers almost. We have the percentage of racial minorities on the x-axis. You have the income of these households on the y-axis. And you can see it's like a cake where you have the red are the lowest income homes, but they have the greatest racial diversity. And as you go to the wealthiest people, the blue, they have less than 50% non-white, so meaning it's predominantly white. And so if this was equal, it wouldn't be like a pyramid, it would be evenly distributed if there was no racial structure. So this is the structure of income and race at the census block scale. And then we looked at what happens to energy use intensity as a proxy for energy efficiency or investments in energy efficiency. And you could see the slopes are significantly different and racial structure. So we looked at each subgroup within each income group. We found that there was actually a race effect. And so we looked at the blue people only, the red people, all of these different income groups. And except for the highest income, which is not very diverse anyway, we found a measurable, statistically significant effect of race on something as simple as energy efficiency. And then we looked at it spatially. I won't go through the detail, but the goal is that the message is that one really needs to unpack income and race. Otherwise, everything gets clubbed into income. And this idea of caste-based or race-based inequality gets hidden by income. And people think that's what is true. And it's good for us as scientists to be able to show with good, rigorous study, does it or does it not? In all cases, that may not be the case. But at least in this situation, there was a clear signal. And so these new fine-scale methods to unpack income and race reveal 5 times greater social disparity in energy use intensity, especially during the cooling and heating season, than previously known in the US. And so such kinds of measurements can be really important. And then the last one is we actually did field work because there's somewhat little understanding of how heat stress is actually experienced by people in cities. So we did two kinds of things. We took a sensor. You can see this gentleman is wearing a sensor like a pendant, which measures humidity and temperature over a 24-hour period. We also had my PhD student and a local researcher have a sensor on top of a auto rickshaw, which went around the city. And we also took thermal camera images of buildings. And so you could see this is a building with just a fan on top. And I don't know if you can see the temperatures here, that the roof was at 50 degrees Celsius, which is incredibly hot. The whole house was at 40 degrees Celsius, which is again extremely high heat and also humidity. And we looked at this to really show who's impacted, how much they're impacted, and how and when they're impacted. And so I wanted to show over here, again, this is innovation and data, how you gather data. It's not only about AI and machine learning, there's a lot you can do by going and actually measuring things that haven't been measured. And so we look here at an office worker, middle income, has an AC in the house, and commutes by an air-conditioned metro. And most of this person's life, or the day of their life that we gave them the pendant, is all in green, which is the lowest risk. Where you can see a few times, and you can see this is in the morning, when they go out, they're experiencing some heat, but most of their day is in the office. They have a little bit of going out, then they're at home, then they switch on the AC. You can actually see it. But look at that and how it contrasts with an industry worker. So this is an industry worker who's in a very hot industry, evidently, and look at their heat stress. This is the feels like temperature. When you combine heat and humidity, they're experiencing things like 60 degrees Celsius, right? And you can see when they only have a fan at home and they commute by motorcycle. The idea here is to say that it's not only your home, it's the way you commute, it's where you work, everything together shapes your heat exposure. The third one shows a researcher who happened to be doing field work during one of the hottest days in Delhi when the temperature was 46 degrees. Incredibly and, mind-blowingly hot. And then the last one is probably the one that is very difficult to see because this is showing the man who irons clothes. I don't know if this happens in Lebanon and other countries in the Middle East, but people iron clothes for money, and they usually iron in the neighborhood. They have a little shed. They usually use water to create steam. If you have pressed clothes, they press better with steam. And so this man was low income, only had a fan at home, was cycling, and this was his job, ironing clothes, and he was still ironing when it was extremely hot. And his, this is just very difficult to see. This was his entire day is spent at very high exposure. So I just wanted to say that we can really make impactful ask impactful questions, gather impactful data, organize your research to reveal the kinds of things that are happening that others have not revealed that can really inform policy through engagement. So I just had a few closing remarks that from these three case studies, and basically that income inequality is stark and it substantially impacts infrastructure. It's not just a developing country thing. It happens in the US, probably every country, but I showed it here for USA and India. Race matters in the US, caste matters in India, in addition to income or separate from income. It's not just an income effect, and it can be measured and shown to policymakers. New technologies can offer potential for resource sustainability, but they won't automatically make things equal or equitable. And so they have to be designed for equity, and to design for equity, we as scientists have to learn to co-produce science, technology assessments, and policy recommendations, which are broad swath of stakeholders, so that you have procedural equity. And that's essential to create both the sustainability for the environment, but also social sustainability and climate resilience that meets the principles of inclusion, social equity, and justice. And then I'll just end with this because this is something I feel strongly. We're all on this bandwagon of AI and ML. I see it everywhere. And I'm not sure at all that it's going to bring us social sustainability. In fact, my original paper in Science, that was the idea. We really need to know systems. It doesn't take much to know that 40% of people need clean cooking fuels. I don't need any more quantitative data than that. I think where you can really have an impact is in understanding where policy interventions are not working. And that means a lot of engagement with implementation scientists to really understand why even when policymakers are having good intentions, they roll out programs, why don't those programs work? So that's my thought that AI and ML, and there's also negative impacts. I won't go into that here, but maybe it's a Q&A of AI and ML too. The energy draw, how much do we need? It's a whole other topic. So thank you, Lama, Lara, and others for organizing this, and Hiba, it's a pleasure to talk to you all. Please reach out if you have.
Thank you so much, Professor Ramaswami, for this amazing presentation and for sharing all this great work with us. So we're going to open the floor for questions from the audience to all speakers in this track. We have a question from the audience. Also, online attendees, feel free to type in your questions in the chat as well.
Yeah, hello. My name is David Mata. I have a question to Dr. Nasrawi, and it's regarding resilience. I truly enjoyed the talk, and but I had a question about what do we mean by resilience? Resilience against what? Because we have different types of shocks that a community or a city can be. Could be an earthquake, could be a pandemic, could be. So if you can explain a little bit, because the readiness for shocks has to do with what type of shock is it? So how do you take it into consideration when you are talking about that? And the second question is to Dr. Ramaswamy. I also enjoyed very much the definitions that you give to sustainable development. It's holistic, that it has all, and also the systemic way of looking at it also made a lot of sense. It is also whole. But I have a question about, when we talk about the migration from rural to urban, that it might reach 70%, in the years to come. Do you see any effect of AI and artificial intelligence in a way softening this trend or maybe reversing it because it doesn't matter where we live more and more? Or could be maybe the future of work would change the way things are living. So if you can give us some thoughts about this, I would appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you, David.
Okay, so Dr. Lama, if you allow me, I'll take the floor first, since the first question was addressed to me. Thank you so much for the question, and definitely the concept of resilience is a large concept, and it includes lots and lots and lots of facets, let's say, and factors to consider. But I started saying that urban resilience is this measurable ability of, of course, we're talking about the urban sphere, not resilience per se, because resilience per se is very wide. When it comes to urban resilience, I talked about the measurable ability of urban systems. The city is a system on its own. And the inhabitants and the people within the city to maintain continuity. So how resilient are you is how much you're able to continue doing what you're doing when a certain stress occurs. Now, stress also has different types. It could be something related to climate change. It could be a natural hazard. It could be a pandemic. It could be different types of stresses, right? urban, and I focused on urban economic resilience, which focuses on economic shocks. I mean, we all live in Lebanon, and we know the economic shock that the country faced, and the different cities were affected differently if we are speaking about the urban sphere. So when I came and said there are 5 key resilience areas to consider when thinking of building urban economic resilience, and I mentioned, I mean, I hope I'm not going to forget one of them, but like I mentioned 5 key resilience areas, which are the labor market, how resilient it is. We look at the different factors. We talked about governance. We talked economic governance, I guess. We talked about the financial environment. We talked about the business environment. We talked about the infrastructure. So the economic shocks, and how do economic shocks affect those systems constituting the city? Because the city is a system of systems. So that's just an example. I hope I answered your question.
So I think I'll come back to what I was saying, that AI and ML by itself is not going to make the world more equitable unless we look at the structures that are behind them. So, for example, it is true, and there are good examples where you can create rural employment by having people in villages annotate, images. But we've had many examples where in India they're saying, here, we can send you, because India actually has a lot of smartphone coverage. You can send images of plants or pests or something else so that your machine learning model can identify plants and pests. This is for agriculture. We have also people doing translations. So for natural language processing, you send a text to be read in different dialects, and you can pay people, and it does work. But again, the question is, can you do it ethically? And there are some examples where that has happened, because they're paid extremely low for the gains that the companies make, which are not being shared with the people who are contributing labor. So we can discuss this, but there are companies actually addressing this, which are wonderful. Some of them have been featured on the cover of Time magazine, and some of the solutions are to pay those people who are just sort of, they're basically tagging images, and so pay them to be part of the profit that whatever product comes out of this. So that's a game changer, because that would increase their wealth. Another thought is to pay them much more than the basic pay. That can only be sustained for a little bit. And then the third thing is to upskill them so that they're not only tagging data, but they can be part of this economy. And I'm not an economist to know how many people you need in the labor market to do this, because if you have, generative artificial intelligence, potentially no one may be needed at all. So I think these are all interesting questions. I don't know the answer to it, but I want to come back to those 7 provisioning systems, whether we provide them in rural areas or urban areas. I think that should be the number one priority. If a fraction of investments that are going to AI could be diverted to these very basic provisioning systems, I think we could solve a lot of these problems. Then we don't need very advanced machine learning to do that. I think the challenge runs in how you implement these solutions. And if we can know more about the barriers and implementation, I think that would be really interesting. So anyway, that's my thought. Thank you for a great question.
Thank you. We have another question from the audience.
Thank you very much to all the panelists. And my name is Makram Awais. I'm with the Lebanese Center for Policy Studies. And my question is for Dr. Ramaswamy specifically. I really like the study that you did on, and obviously in times of crises, we experience the changes in levels of income, changes in levels of dealing with all these indicators. And my question is just about, you've used different tools, and my question to you is, how sustainable do you think these tools are in providing for an early warning system of major spikes and discrepancies? Thank you.
So I think that was for Professor Lawal. Because I didn't present on resilience, but I could say that general indicators for infrastructure performance and service delivery can be measured even on an annual basis. Most of the data I use in India is through decadal surveys. So we measure them every 10 years through the government survey. But with the advances we now have, so for example, power disruptions are publicly available data in some countries, and that's excellent. They may not release it publicly, but it is data that the government has on, for example, power data in India, how often it goes, when it goes, and who it goes, who experiences the power cut is out there. It's public information. And so some of the things, like the COVID pandemic disrupted services, but if you can account for them in your metrics, and you can still show metrics of how sustainable or efficient different cities are in providing services. But I think I'll let Sukaina maybe answer more in terms of hazards.
Yes, thank you so much. But actually, you've said what I wanted to say. I'll just add basically the nature of the factors that we are capturing when it comes to basic services and connectivity, and the resilience of basic service infrastructure and connectivity when it comes to building urban economic resilience. As I said, it is one of the 5 key areas for building urban economic resilience. And we look into cases like the coverage and functionality of a basic infrastructure. So we look at we look at coverage and functionality of the infrastructure. What is the scope of coverage? Do they function, yes or no, when in times of shocks, etc. We also look at issues related to, for example, health service coverage and how sustainable it is in terms of in times of crises and stresses, etc. We also look at issues related to connectivity and mobility. I mean, we notice, for example, whenever, unfortunately, in Lebanon, for example, whenever a certain a shock happens, for example, a certain explosion or whatever, the connectivity is down. Directly. So how resilient is the city for shocks of different types when it comes to connectivity? And this type of data is available. It is available at the national level. And if not, and we're working on cities, there are different operators where we can get data. In terms of mobility, for example, how resilient mobility infrastructure is when it comes to stresses and when it comes to shocks. Like, for example, if it's a natural hazard, how resilient it is. If it's an economic shock, would that lead to a certain restrictions in terms of mobility? Do policies in the city or strategies in the country enable a certain anomaly in the mobility, yes or no? So these are factors that we look into. And if you're interested, I mean, the diagnostic and planning tool really goes into all the details of the resilience areas, the sub-indicators, and the indicators, the numeric indicators themselves. Yeah, over.
Okay, well, thank you so much for our distinguished speakers in this session. Great presentations that you shared with us. And with this, we conclude this track. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much,
Thank
Dr.
you for having me.
Thank
it was wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you to all the speakers too. It's been